The game Cooking Companions perfectly captures the inability to escape from your past mistakes and how stubbornly doubling down can only last so long before it breaks you. But what happens when you break a monster? Do they become good, or do they just double down? For those of you who haven't seen it, Cooking Companions follows a group of 4 lost travelers who stumble upon you and your cabin. Anatoly, the bookworm of the group, Karine, the stubborn woman who's a little more sadistic than they let on, Gregor, the himbo powered on optimism, and Mariah, the vegetarian with a can-do attitude. As you begin to connect with the 4 of them, things begin to go south as it begins to flood, forcing you all to stay within the cabin. Due to not rationing the food properly, you all no longer have enough to eat and must do your best to survive until the storm is gone. Unfortunately for the cabin goers, spoilers for Cooking Companions, pause now if you haven't seen it, but you are actually playing as the Baba Yaga, a character from Slavic folklore that, should newcomers answer incorrectly to their questions, will eventually be eaten, primarily children. In the game, each person quote-unquote leaves the cabin one after another. First Mariah, then Anatoly, then Gregor, and lastly Karine. Well, depending on the ending, of course. There's also a full DLC going in depth about the origins of the Chompettes and answering some of the unanswered questions, like what's the importance of Razael, or who was the butcher of Zakopane. However, that's just the basics, as Cooking Companions is practically a masterclass on subtlety. I'd even argue it's a good example of modern horror done right, as it doesn't rely on jump scares alone to be spooky, and instead leans heavily on atmosphere and anticipation, 2 of the main hallmarks of modern horror. And its themes of cannibalism aren't just done for shock value either, it all has purpose and properly displays the horrors of that level of desperation. But what I really appreciate is the theme of inner guilt and the attempt to escape from the consequences of your own mistakes, which we see several times, both blatant and subtle. The very concept of this game is built on this theme, how you waste all the rations and everyone starves. It was you who wasted so many of the emergency rations on the vegetable stew and the cabbage rolls, and now you all have to sit and stir with the gnawing sensation knowing you're all going to die, but being unable to do anything to prevent it. And it only gets worse with you, the player, prolonging it with cannibalism. Each time someone leaves the cabin, the next day we get meat, which heavily implies that you take it from the bodies once they've washed up back to the cabin and made a fine feast. That, and the fact that each time you take some, you lose more of your humanity. After Mariah gets filleted, you tell the others that you're going to ration better, again only prolonging the hunger, but in only 2 days that all goes bad, which shouldn't be possible. It should still be good for another 3 to 5 days, but we're lying and saying that's gone bad. Not to mention any ending where Karine is trapped in the basement, they have enough meat to last them weeks, showing we were definitely keeping a good deal of it squirreled away for ourselves. Likely because, well, we're the Baba Yaga. Of course we're not going to want any of them to survive to the end of the storm because they'll just leave. But then there's also the question of why we aren't eating. We get messages about hunger pains, so we know we're starving just as much as they are, so why starve? Well, I think it's out of guilt. Let's look back at the ending with Karine again, shall we? Basically, Karine becomes so obsessed with the meat that she begins to go insane as she willingly offs each of her friends, and if we don't have full hearts with her, she also seems more than willing to off us when the others run out. So when she begins to go down to the basement, we lock the door behind her and leave her for weeks, hoping she'll pass on her own rather than us having to deal with her like we do later on. And given the ease in which we kill her, when we eventually do, it's odd how we just let her get trapped down there to get stronger, which even Potato points out. This idea of locking something away instead of dealing with it parallels earlier in the timeline with the Chompettes, a group of children, and the butcher whom we killed, but because of the guilt of killing Razael, we don't let them go, locking them away in our mind as the hallucinatory Chompettes, and refusing to deal with our feelings, which would let them move on. This further compounds when, in one of the endings, a new Chompette appears called Turnip, whom is heavily suspected to be Karine's soul, really wrapping it all together. But let's touch on Razael for a second, shall we? As MatPat once said, Razael is the Golden Freddy of the franchise, frequently alluded to and mentioned but never shown. Razael was captured, likely by the butcher, and then given to the Baba Yaga and eaten. However, they took a while to do it, as the drawings of Razael made it indicate that he lived long enough that he was fed the meat too. As the Baba Yaga was fattening him up, they started to connect with him. After all, he's frequently referenced as being a fountain of pure life and energy, and Potato mentions that we hesitated with him. The Baba Yaga didn't want to kill him, but she knew she had to, likely to keep living, seeing as in folklore she eats children to live forever. However, she begins to regret this, as now she has to live with the fact she snuffed out such a pure and happy beacon of life. We don't care as much about it, we've lost passion. Our actions are beginning to eat us from the inside out. Not to mention Raziel, also known as Cornbread, was the first to leave too. They got to move on while the rest of the Chompettes have to stay. When the Chompettes were alive, they were looking for Raziel, suspecting the butcher to be behind it, but being chased into the woods and into our cabin. It is there that the butcher catches up to him, says, "Say hi to Raziel for me," and then right in that moment, dies by our hand. Our hesitance in killing Razael is what leads to everything. To the Chompettes' death and eventual rebirth. To our hesitance in killing the newcomers. To our guilt, our nightmares, and our eventual hesitancy to even finish the job. All over something we did long ago that we were trying to stubbornly get through by endlessly repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And Potato hates this. You see, the Chompettes, who are again the souls of a group whom you killed, will begin to start begging you to save each member after Mariah leaves. First is to stop Anatoly from leaving the cabin, which we don't even get a choice in. Then it's Gregor, whom we know Karine wants to drug and eat from, and again, we have no choice in the matter. If we refuse, Karine does it anyways, and we don't stop them, instead just trying to drown out the screaming. But unfortunately, even if we want to save them, we can't do anything, because our fate has already been sealed the moment we cut a slab at Mariah and repeat the cycle. There was no way to escape from our actions that point forward. But again, these actions were already made a long time ago, and not even by us, the player, but by the Baba Yaga. Our guilt is really shown in all the nightmares we get, all of which are rather violent towards us, because deep down, we hate what we're doing. We hate how nice these people are being, because it reminds us of Razael, which is pretty likely why we're so upset with Karine for having Gregor suffer. Even our nightmares follow this idea of consequences and the inability to escape from your past actions. In the first nightmare we get on day 2, something is riding on our back and won't get off. After trying everything, we go to the river, desperate to drown it, only to drown ourselves. This particular nightmare is based on the myth of the Liko, an embodiment of evil fate and misfortune. Seem familiar? The second nightmare follows a folktale called Baba Yaga and the Brave Youth, in which, in her frustration of the boy not laying down on the tray, she does it herself, only to be thrown in the oven and cooked alive just as she was planning to do with him. The third tells a similar tale, based on another Russian folktale, Baba Yaga and the Twins, in which the Baba Yaga asks the guests to sit on a shovel, to be pushed into an oven, and when they refuse, she shows them how, only to be pushed in herself. Chasing the two through the forest, they throw a cloth behind them, which opens up a chasm to hell. Nightmare 4 is another myth about the Liko, specifically the opening section of the folktale One-Eyed Liko, in which a blacksmith says they can forge anything, and when we jokingly ask, "Forge me a new eye then," they tie us to a chair, take a hot poker out of the coals, and plunge it through our skull. Nightmare 5 involves a fox asking for payment, in which we give them 2 dogs but put a bunch of chickens on top. That way the dogs will tear the fox apart when he later opens it. However, that was your only food, so you starve to death out in the woods. This one is based off a Hungarian folktale called A Fox Seeks Shelter, particularly its ending, with the fox meeting a similar fate. And the last nightmare, which isn't really a nightmare, is just us dismembering Anatoly, which really did happen, we just don't want to think about it, hence it being a nightmare. We're regretting it again. And this even ties into nightmare mode, which, although this isn't wholly serious or canon, you repeatedly eat and sleep, not doing much of anything else. This again depicts the Baba Yaga's depression, another consequence from their past mistakes. The Trompette cabin courses too, which is supposed to be a distraction, something new and separate from the story, but keeps going back to what we did, as Raspberry won't let us forget about what we have done, like when we baked one of them into a crust and threw half of it away without hesitation. As a matter of fact, each of the Chompettes, on top of representing each of the children, and to some extent each of the campers, also represent our own perception and level of self-forgiveness and or avoidance of our past. Cabbage is avoidant, in that they do their best to avoid talking about what happened, and will outright stop others who try to. Raspberry, on the other hand, is the opposite, and truly want us to hate ourselves for what we did, constantly reminding us of our wrongdoing and how vile of a person we are. Potato, however, being the soul of the butcher, wants us to double down. They become angry at us for becoming weaker by feeling remorse for our actions, hesitating. Onion is self-deprecating, making many jokes at our expense, jokes which we know the truth behind, whether that be our bad smell or killing 5 in one night. While lastly, Bread acts as sort of an opposite to Onion, using humor as a tactic of avoidance instead of hostility. Another thing of note are the Max Heart scenes, which tell you a bit about their backstory. More specifically, what happens without Max Hearts, as in the Max Heart choice, if you haven't maxed out your relationship, Anatoly will call you out for being a despicable human being. Right before Anatoly is being pressured to go find Mariah out in the floods, Anatoly says, "You know what's in this basement, don't you?" And if we don't have enough hearts, no matter what, he demands we get away from him. Saying no, he says we aren't fooling anyone and runs off. Saying yes, though, he says, "Of course you do. How else would you keep us fed? Please get away from me." You can't win. And this is the only person who calls us out for it, as Mariah dies too soon, Gregor is too much of a himbo optimist, and Kareen, well, is Kareen. Lastly, let's talk endings. In the normal ending, after trapping Kareen in the basement, we keep hearing her voice in the cabin despite the fact she's still in the basement. Seeing as she isn't dead at this point, we can say for certain that's our conscious being guilty yet again, unable to stop thinking about her being locked below. The only way to get it to end is trekking down to the basement where we finish her off and are forced to face our actions. Reap what you sowed. Turn on the light. We can also see a post-credits scene where we see how the Baba Yaga and Travelers met. The fact this happens at the end of every normal playthrough is interesting in that it shows a narrative cycle. We end where we started. In New Game Plus, we can get the true ending where you and Potato leave the cabin to continue to feast. Only now, not having to wait for newcomers, having fresh people every day. We know that this is the true ending because that's where we start off in Dreadway, the upcoming sequel to Cooking Companions. This is also the only ending in which we finally let go of the Chompettes, but that doesn't mean that they have escaped from their actions. Although we don't see what happened between Dreadway and Cooking Companions, we know that the Baba Yaga wants vengeance on Ivan, meaning Ivan must have done something to the Baba Yaga to make her want him dead. Ivan is also a character from Slavic folklore, in which after getting help from 2 other Baba Yagas, he arrives to what is likely our Baba Yaga, because of the house built under chicken bones, to which he blows 3 horns, causing birds to swarm the hut. One of the birds is the Firebird, which Ivan jumps to the back of to escape, and the Baba Yaga is left with nothing more than a fistful of Firebird feathers. Point being that this theme continues as we, the MC of Dreadway, are told the only way to not die to the Baba Yaga is to kill Ivan ourselves. Hey, sorry I'm slipping this in like last second. I realized I never actually talked about the whole Kurt and Ivan being the same person thing, which isn't really like a confirmed thing. That's just kind of a theory I have. And I don't know a whole lot about a lot of the Ivan folklore stuff, but I'm thinking that Kurt is lying about their actual name as effectively in witness protection against the Baba Yaga because of the Baba Yaga trying to murder them and all that. So I think that they're lying about their name and why they're here and such like that. But just to clarify, that's not really a canon thing, and I keep calling Kurt Ivan here, so yeah. Bye. So it seems that whether by us or the Baba Yaga, Ivan will be unable to escape from his past actions either. But let's go back to that question I brought up at the start. What happens when you break a monster? Well, in the Baba Yaga's case, we can see both possibilities play out in the endings of Cooking Companions. We see them effectively become good in the ending where they willingly help the spirits do the ritual in the Mariah ending, as well as willingly turning on the lights to face the spirit's wrath in the normal ending, both of which being caused by the Baba Yaga becoming remorseful and being willing to face the consequences. In the Potato ending though, we definitely become worse, as our breakdown leads to the deaths of many more lives, as we not only forget the Chompettes, but we forget the one thing that made us second guess ourselves in the first place, Razael. But I think that's all I have for this time around. Peace.